Good morning. Welcome to the April CAPE lecture. My name's David Brown. I'm an emeritus professor of development sociology and also CAPE's past president. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce Warren Brown. Warren will speak about the 2020 census. The census is critically important with respect to a number of issues. First of all, it's used for the allocation of federal resources. Also, it's used to allocate seats in the House of Representatives. It's used in the targeting of public policy, and not unimportantly, it's a critical resource for social science research and policy development. At the Cornell Institute for Social and Economic Research, Warren directed the program of applied demographics, and he served as director of the Federal Statistical Research Data Center. Now, the Federal Statistical Research Data Center is a really important institution here at Cornell. It's the place where confidential data from the census is stored, and so it's very important to manage the confidentiality restraints on the data. Previously, Warren directed the Applied Demography Program at the Carl Vinson Institute for Government of the University of Georgia, and he also served as Georgia's state demographer. He served on the steering committee of the National State Data Center Network and was elected president of the Association of Public Data Users. Warren served on the National Academy of Sciences panel to review the 2010 census and on its standing committee on re-engineering census operations. So again, it is my pleasure to introduce Warren Brown. He will speak on the 2020 census, the challenges and controversies associated with it. So Warren, take it away.
Thank you, David. I appreciate your kind words. I'm going to talk about the census of population and housing, its purpose, which David briefly went over, and then various phases. Development of the address list to carry out the census, the questionnaire, the responses, and the important way of motivating people to participate in the census. Then after the data are all collected, how the results get reported for purposes of reapportionment and redistricting. How is the quality of the data assessed? And then finally, what is currently probably the most controversial is balancing privacy and utility in the census and new developments in that area. So, starting with the constitutional mandate, I think folks are probably aware that the Constitution says something about the census. Well, it directly addresses the fact that the population has to be enumerated, and that's used for allocating seats in the House of Representatives. What is another important part of that constitutional mandate is the last sentence that I've got here, that the actual enumeration shall be made in such manner as they, referring to Congress, shall by law direct. So that while the Constitution mandates that a census be conducted, it's up to Congress to approve what data are collected and how the census is conducted. So along those lines, the very first Census Act, coming into every census, Congress authorizes the census. The very first one in 1790, stating how the census should be carried out, that a key phrase in that lower part of my slide here is that the number of the inhabitants within their respective districts. So note that in the original Census Act, there's no mention of only count citizens or only count some subset of the population. Rather, it's all inhabitants. And in fact, later on in this Census Act, the oath that is spelled out that U.S. Marshals and note that the original census takers were the federal marshals and their assistants. Anyway, in that oath that the marshals take, it says that they have to enumerate all persons resident. So again, underscoring the fact that we're talking about people who reside there. And then later on in that act, in section 5, it talks about counting persons at their usual place of abode. So the very same rules that are used in the 2020 census were spelled out in that original Census Act of 1790, and proves to show sort of the consistency from the very beginning. So that's the congressional mandate, the constitutional and then the congressional mandate for conducting the census. The 2020 census was posed with a challenge to constrain rising costs. The cost of the decennial census had been more than or approximately doubling every decade. And you can see that on my chart here, between 2000 and 2010, the cost went from 4.5 billion on up to $13 billion. And Congress said, we can't continue to fund this activity at that level. You have to constrain costs and do the 2020 census for what it cost to do the census in 2010, even though population is growing and that there is increasing difficulty. This constraint put a sort of limit on how much funds would be available for research, testing, design, and development to carry out the 2020 census and the innovations that were necessary. So this posed a serious challenge to the census folks, and in fact, that was part of what the committee at the National Academy of Sciences that I served on. We had the task of sitting and listening to the Census Bureau and their plans, and to help advise them how to do as good a job, if not better, than they did in 2010, with no increase in funding. So heading into the 2020 census, there were a number of challenging factors that had been anticipated. The little circle at the top right, constrained fiscal environments, what I've been talking about. In addition, you could put these challenges into 4 categories. Population that is hard to locate, that are hard to contact, that are hard to persuade, and that are hard to interview. The hard to locate housing units that aren't necessarily in the Census Bureau's standard address list, or the Postal Service doesn't know about them, or local governments have a hard time identifying them. That's a challenge, as well as persons who frankly want to remain hidden and don't want to be contacted by the government. The hard to contact, these are the highly mobile population. These are people at pretty much both ends of the economic spectrum. We've got people who are experiencing homelessness, who are hard to track down, as well as people, snowbirds, and people who live behind, within gated communities that are hard to reach and contact. The hard to persuade, people who are suspicious, have distrusting government, that low levels of civic engagement, which appears to be increasing over time. And then finally, the hard to interview, and particularly difficult to get them to self-respond. Self-response is a very important part of containing costs and getting quality information. So the barriers there are language, limited ability to use English, low literacy rates, as well as lack of internet access, because the 2020 census was pushing people for the first time to respond online. Those were the problems and the barriers that were anticipated. little did all of us, and particularly the Census Bureau, know that coming in March 2020, a whole host of unforeseen obstacles were now going to make what was already known to be a difficult undertaking a really difficult undertaking. So late March, as the Census Bureau is ready to roll out their campaign of mailing out to every known address an invitation to participate in the census, along comes COVID-19. And field operations for the census had to be put on hold and delayed while we figured out when they could be resumed. When they kicked back in the summertime, at a time when field operations really should have been wrapped up, we were experiencing multiple hurricanes, a series of wildfires, and civil unrest in many areas of the country that further hampered field operations of the Census Bureau. So if that wasn't enough, layered on top of all of these challenges is partisan politics. This is one of the most politically charged and contentious censuses. Not the only one, but certainly one of the ones near the top in terms of contentiousness. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the citizenship question on the 2020 census, which was removed due to Supreme Court ruling, but there were lingering effects of that citizenship question that made groups of the population of the United States, of the inhabitants, suspicious of possible negative consequences of participating in the census. In addition, the Trump administration and the Commerce Department, which oversees the Census Bureau, had appointed 4 new deputy directors. This had never been done in the past. There was a deputy director for policy purposes, a deputy director for data, and it was highly politically charged. In addition, the Census Bureau asked for an extension of time to gather data because of the pause due to COVID-19. And they were not given as much time as they had requested. There was a shortened timeline in order to wrap things up by the end of the year. All right, so those are the problems of carrying it out. Let's begin and let's talk about the development of the address list. So I've got a little address book picture there on the left to sort of represent this address list. Census Bureau doesn't really care in developing the address list of the name and who is at that address. What they want is a comprehensive and complete list of the location of every structure where people might reside. And the best source of information, or one of the better sources of information, comes from the Postal Service itself. The Postal Service, on a regular basis, shares their delivery sequence file information with the Census Bureau to update their address list. So who better to know where a new housing unit, new housing development may be ready to be occupied and people start living there and start receiving mail, or on the other hand, that a housing unit has been destroyed, perhaps by natural disaster, or has been torn down. The Postal Service maintains a very timely list, and that is of great help to the Census Bureau in updating their address list. The next one down, the house sitting there on those dollar bills, local property tax records. The Census Bureau worked with local governments, state and local governments, whose major source of information about addresses and living housing units are their property tax records, which are incredibly useful. And then finally, to send canvassers out walking the streets to see what they can observe. to confirm that the address list is complete, to make corrections, to make additions and deletions. Sending canvassers out ahead of the census in order to verify and update the address list is one of the most expensive parts of the entire census operation. So I'm talk a little bit more about the role of state and local government. And at Cornell's program on applied demographics, we're part of New York State's Census 2020 effort, and had developed a tool to help local government in New York State to compare their address lists with what the Census Bureau had. The Census Bureau has a program called the Local Update of Census Addresses, and it's known by the acronym LUCA, L-U-C-A. Local officials are signed an oath not to release any information that they learned from the Census Bureau's address list. The Census Bureau's address list itself is confidential, and if you disclose any of that information, you can be prosecuted and punished with a fine and possibly imprisonment. So anyway, they take that confidentiality very seriously. But what it enabled was local officials had the opportunity, once they had sworn allegiance and got training, to compare information that they had with what the Census Bureau had on their address list. What I've got on the screen here is a shot from this tool, the Nibbles, the New York Block Browser Luca Evaluation System. A little background about the development. We were building on work that had been begun integrating geographic information systems with demographic data that Professor Joe Francis, my predecessor as director of the program on applied demographics, had begun. The bulk of the work in developing this tool was done by Jan Vink, an extension associate in our program. And Jan had become sort of a guru on the use of property tax records and how you could tease out information from those records, link it to aerial imagery and to Census Bureau geography. The yellow lines displayed on this view of the Cornell campus and the surrounding neighborhoods, you probably see the golf course and the arboretum noted there, and then you can see downtown. Anyway, those are census blocks, and census blocks may have nobody living in there. They may have a couple hundred people living in a census block. The more dense the population is, the smaller the blocks, and as you get out into less populated area, blocks can get bigger. Anyway, the Census Bureau's address list identifies what block that address is located in. And this tool and various other tools enabled people to take property tax records and overlay them by block and to see, is there a discrepancy? If the Census Bureau says there's 53 housing units in the block and your records show there's 53 housing units in the block, you can assume, okay, they've got everything we've got, move on. It helps you to identify where are the blocks that the Census Bureau might be missing housing units. Our efforts, and primarily efforts of local governments, planning departments, regional planning departments, and in particular the New York City Department of City Planning, during this local update of census addresses, New York State added 250,000 addresses to the Census Bureau's list. That's a pretty impressive addition of addresses and help to ensure that we get a complete and accurate count of people residing in New York State. If you've got every possible place where people could live, it increases the chances that at least starts to knock off that hard to locate part of the process. So the Census Bureau, in order to contain costs, I had the picture of the canvasser earlier, and I had mentioned that that's one of the most expensive parts of the process. What the Census Bureau realized was that most of the blocks in the country had not changed since the 2010 census. There were no additional housing units. And how do you identify blocks that you really don't need to put people out into the field to go examine and just confirm that, yep, there hasn't been any change? And they used aerial imagery together with geographic information systems. A member of our National Academy of Sciences committee, Don Cook, who is a pioneering geographer in the private geographic information systems industry, was on our committee, and he introduced this idea and the methodology that the Census Bureau then adopted, that you had statistical clerks working in a central location, reviewing aerial imagery and all of the address information, similar to the Nibbles tool that I was showing before. But anyway, they could compare pictures of the block at the time of the 2010 census and a current image, aerial image, to see, was there any signs of change? If there were signs of change that were not covered by Postal Service addresses or by addresses that local governments had supplied, they could then refer those blocks for in-field canvassing. So it was a combination of in-office address canvassing and in-field address canvassing, reducing the need for in-field address canvassing for approximately 65% of the addresses in the nation. This was a huge cost savings, and we believe that it was another contribution, not only to cost savings, but to having a quality review of the address list. Another challenge is hidden housing units. With aerial imagery, you can't identify hidden housing units. And so where there was suspicion that there would be hidden housing units, they were referred for in-field address canvassing. If the canvassers on their address list had that a structure was a single family housing unit, and they went up to the front door, and in that top right picture, you can see multiple doorbells. These are cases that perhaps it's an unauthorized conversion of a larger, older home into multiple units, or at least something that hadn't been picked up. They had a common mail drop, so the post office didn't identify them as separate, but it enabled the canvassers to say, you know, it looks like there are multiple units within this structure. Let's number them A, B, C, and D, if there were 4 there, and mail invitations to participate in the census to all 4 and keep track of that. That was a major source of the addition of housing units, particularly in New York City. The other thing is the central top photo there of flower and gift shop, that a lot of commercial structures, what appears, by property tax records and perhaps aerial imagery to be a commercial structure, may have living quarters up above, apartments, and that can be identified by field canvassers, and as well as structures in the backyard, and down below on the left-hand side, a shed or garage or a barn that is listed as not as a residential unit, And it turns out, oh no, there are people living in that barn. It's part equipment storage and it's part living unit. So those are some examples of the hidden housing units, which really are quite a challenge to identify and require in-field canvassing. All right. So the questionnaire, the items that are going to be asked in the decennial census, by law, the Census Bureau has to deliver these questions to Congress 2 years before Census Day. So in late March 2018, the Census Bureau submitted these topics and questions to the Census Bureau. How many people are living in the unit? Is it owned or rented? The names of the people, the household relationship, sex, age, date of birth, Hispanic origin, race, and citizenship status. So that citizenship status was one that the Department of Commerce required the Census Bureau to add. The rationale provided at the time was that these statistics are essential for enforcing the Voting Rights Act and its protections against voting discrimination. The Supreme Court subsequently ruled that they had not followed proper procedure in adding that citizenship question, and so they were not allowed to ask it. But before that ruling came down, the Census Bureau decided that it was necessary to test what is going to be the impact on response rates, the willingness of residents to complete a census questionnaire by adding that citizenship question. And so in 2018, the Census Bureau decided with a sample survey to test some of the questionnaires were mailed out with the citizenship question, and some were mailed out without it. At this point, let me add that the adding of the citizenship question, it was more of a procedural or technical reason that the Supreme Court did not allow that to go forward, that the courts have said previously that the Constitution gives Congress the authority to collect statistics. As early as 1870, the Supreme Court questioned as unquestionable, or characterized as unquestionable, the power of Congress to require both an enumeration and the collection of statistics in the census. So it wasn't inherent that citizenship could not be asked in the census. It was rather the process by which that came about. And then we have the concern of the Census Bureau that this is going to suppress response rates. So the Census Bureau tests some of the questionnaires that were mailed out in this test sample survey. Ask this question: is this person a citizen of the United States? And the categories. Now the Census Bureau asks this question on other surveys, but they hadn't done it in the census of population. The tests showed that if the questionnaires with the citizenship question had a self-response rate of 51.5%. Those without the citizenship question had a self-response rate of 52%. So in other words, it was not really significant, the difference in response rate between those that had the citizenship question and those that did not. The difference, however, was observed for minority groups where there were substantial, significant differences. And that's useful information going forward should a future Congress decide that they want to put that on, let's say, the 2020 census. Anyway, it was June of 2019, so we're getting really close to the deadline. This is when the printing of the questionnaires and everything else, it's like we got to have a decision here. June of 2019, that the Supreme Court, in a split decision, expand the citizenship question. So here's what the questionnaire sort of looks like as it went out. I'm not going to drag you through all the instructions to the respondents about who to count and who not to count. But if you have time later, this talk is going to be posted anyway. The rules adhere very similar to what the 1790 instructions were. Basically, everybody who's living here, everybody for whom this is their usual place of residence, that's who you should count. And then question number one, how many people were living or staying in this house, apartment, mobile home on April 1, 2020? Number of people. There are some folks who say that's all the census should do. It should not include any other questions about persons' characteristics. And yet it's very clear, again, back to the Constitution and the Census Act of 1790 and consistent since then, and the courts have supported it, that no, Congress can approve the collection of additional statistics beyond just a head count of the population. All right, here we get April 1, 2020, Census Day. The Census Bureau begins in earnest its campaign of getting people to respond. I'm not sure how many of you may recall in late March last year getting a letter from the Census Bureau requesting you to go online and complete the 2020 Census questionnaire for your household. Some of you may have had the pleasure of being away from your usual residence and wondered, well, should I answer this at my home in my winter escape spot in Florida? And the answer is, you should supply your usual place of residence, not where you are at that moment. And that's a big distinction that some people were confused about and have, frankly, have been confused about every census. You have the option of going online, completing the census by phone, or if you wanted to request a paper questionnaire, if you did not respond within a timely frame to the online, the Census Bureau would follow up and mail a physical paper questionnaire to the address. With the delays due to COVID-19, the self-response deadline, which had been July of 2020, were extended to September 30th of 2020. So how many people responded to the census, either online, on the phone, or completed a paper questionnaire? This is an important component. The more people that self-respond, the less costly it is, because following up with non-responding addresses is another very expensive component of the census. Also, self-response tends to be the best quality of data. So in the United States as a whole, 67% of the addresses self-responded by the deadline. In New York State, it was slightly less, 64%. In Tompkins County, it was the same level as the state, 64%. Within Tompkins County, there was tremendous variability. I've got information on 2 census tracts within Tompkins County. Collegetown had a self-response rate of 27%. That's not, I was going to say that's not surprising. It's disappointing, but think about in late March, just as the Census Bureau is mailing out to those addresses off-campus student housing, students are dealing with the ramifications of the pandemic and perhaps making plans to get out of town, to go back home to their parental home, a variety of things, and that the decennial census is not, first and foremost on their mind. That low response rate it gives us concern as to the accuracy of census results that are going to show up for not only that neighborhood, but for the city of Ithaca and therefore the county. In contrast, the highest responding census tract was the upper part of South Hill and Danby, where 74% of the people responded. Collegetown, that same census tract in the 2010 census, 52% of the addresses self-responded. Again, it was one of the lower, but it was almost double what it was in the 2020 census, and that's clearly the impact of the COVID-19. So if people don't self-respond, what do? Well, you recruit a massive workforce that's going to go on out into the field and start knocking on doors to see if we can get those addresses to respond. So this non-response operation, which was originally scheduled for May through July of 2020, had to be adjusted because of the pandemic and the shutdown in activities. So it took place from mid-August until the end of September. So now you've made it later, which is always a problem, particularly with a mobile population. And you've also compressed the time frame. You've given them fewer days, fewer weeks in which to carry this out. It's a massive workforce, as I said, to recruit enumerators to follow up with more than 100 million non-responding addresses. Using a combination of direct response to enumerators and the administrative records that the Census Bureau had for that address, where they could try to match federal tax information, Social Security information, other federal administrative records to how many persons is it reasonable to think lived at that address. The Census Bureau, again, a combination of direct responses and those administrative records to complete what would be, have been the what was the situation, what was the condition of people living at that address, that this Census Bureau says that they were able to contact 99.9% of the addresses, right? Two-thirds through, roughly two-thirds through self-response, and then the additional one-third through this non-response follow-up. It will be very interesting to see how the non-responding addresses, let's say in Collegetown, that almost 3/4 of the addresses were handled. How many are classified as vacant, in which nobody gets counted, as well as the characteristics. Are they vastly different than they were in 2010? Remains to be seen. Okay, so data collection is completed, and we move on to the reporting of the data. Two very important products, the reapportionment data and the redistricting data. Both have been delayed as a result of the delays in the data collection and the data processing. The reapportionment data are state-level counts of population, no characteristics, just total population, that is used for allocating seats in the House of Representatives. Those had to be turned over to the president who would then in turn report them to Congress. Those were supposed to have been turned over to the president by the end of 2020. That has been changed. The Census Bureau has said they can do it by April 30th of 2021. Let me jump ahead. This is a bill that was introduced into Congress on Tuesday, April 20th, to extend certain deadlines for the 2020 decennial census. So this is the Census Bureau. All of us are familiar with requests for an incomplete grade. This is the Census Bureau's equivalent of saying, we can't make that deadline. We'd like an incomplete, and we will finish up by April 30th. This is a bipartisan bill working its way through both the House and the Senate that to authorize what essentially is already the situation. So that's the apportionment data. The other one is the redistricting data. These are the data that go down to census blocks, those very small areas that I showed you previously on that map of the Cornell campus area bounded in yellow. For every census block, not only a count of persons, but persons 18 and over, in other words, of voting age, by sex, by race, and by ethnicity, Hispanic or not Hispanic. Those data can be used for redistricting boundaries for congressional districts, which is what the map on the right-hand side of New York State represents, is the congressional districts. Projections of population as to what the April 1, 2020 population of New York State will be compared to the rest of the United States has us losing a seat in the House of Representatives. And so redistricting will have to redo these boundaries in order to come up with equally sized congressional districts. I've been asked, do you think, where do you think we're going to lose that seat? Will it be New York City? Will it be upstate New York? Remains to be seen. But we won't know those data until September 30th of this year. So we're still in suspense as to what's going to happen. So back to partisan politics and some of the controversy affecting the population count. Who should be counted? We have Trump's executive order to identify, requiring the Census Bureau to identify undocumented immigrants in the census counts by census block, so that the president can remove them from the apportionment and the redistricting counts. Not individuals, but aggregate counts of the total population, and what out of that total population, how many of those folks were undocumented immigrants. The Census Bureau was working on that, and the Census Bureau reported that they were unable to accomplish that by the original deadline, which would have been prior to December, the end of December, and said that they would not be ready until late February or early March. As we all know, there was a change that took place between late December and early March. On January 20th, when the new president was sworn in, and one of the very first executive orders that Biden issued was to undo the president's, Trump's prior executive order, and instead instruct that the counts were to count everyone. There's a question as to whether the Census Bureau should even be doing this type of data analysis and data product. Former US Chief Statistician Catherine Wallman, she served as Chief Statistician in the Office of Management and Budget from 1992 to 2017 under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Anyway, Catherine Wallman said, the Census Bureau has been challenged over the last several years by intrusions into its business by policy folks. She went on to say that citizenship data is important to policymakers and the public, but that the Census Bureau is probably not the proper agency to be doing that kind of activity because it crosses the line between what is statistical in nature and what uses might be made of the data down the line. She also worried that it could have a very chilling effect on the population you're trying to get to respond, which could actually depress the response from the public and make the Census Bureau's job far more difficult. So some had said that this level of politicization of the census and apportionment counts, that never before in history has this ever been attempted. Well, back at the very first census, 1790, when Congress and the executive were trying to figure out, okay, how do we use this information to apportion seats in Congress? There were at least two competing proposals for how to formulate those population counts and translate them into seats in the House of Representatives. Hamilton and Jefferson proposed alternative procedures. Jefferson's proposal produced more representatives for Virginia than did Hamilton's. Washington endorsed Jefferson's, and that's what became used with the 1790 census. So obviously Hamilton, a New Yorker, and Jefferson, a Virginian, as has been well documented in the musical Hamilton, differed on quite a few topics, and Jefferson was out to protect representation in Virginia. Another more amazing political was the 1920 census. The bottom line, the 1920 census was never used to reapportion seats in Congress. It's the only time that there was no reapportionment. What had happened was the 1920 census documented that for the first time, over half of the American population lived in urban areas, that the decline, the reduction in the percentage of Americans who lived in rural areas. This was part of an ongoing process of people moving out of agriculture and rural areas into urban areas. The largest cities, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, other cities of 100,000 people or more, were growing rapidly. Northeastern and industrial Midwestern states growing thanks to immigration from Europe. Southerners in Congress argued that congressional seats should be allocated on the number of citizens only. Sound familiar? So no apportionment was carried out following the 1920 census. Representatives elected from southern and rural districts worked to derail the process. And it wasn't until the 1930 census that then that was used to reapportion seats in Congress. All right, how do we know if we had a good census or not? You've probably heard in the past estimates of the undercount. Demographic, and there are two main procedures. Both of them are conducted by the Census Bureau. And in fact, the Census Bureau itself is the best source of information about how well the census did in counting people. Demographic analysis is a technique that is done at the national level and provides very good data on differential coverage by age, sex, race, and ethnicity, but it's only at the national level. And I'll explain, why in a moment. Another method is a post-enumeration survey, which prepares estimates of subnational undercount. This is like a catch and release and recapture survey, similar to wildlife surveys, but in which they use case-by-case matching of persons in an independent survey with persons in the census to determine who was missed or counted in error. This is very good, but it relies on that address list. If a household is not on the address list, then it doesn't get included in the post-enumeration survey. So it's good at saying in these types of households, perhaps a visitor was there, not a member of the family, but was a nephew who was staying with them for some reason, and they didn't include them in the census count. The post-enumeration survey does a very careful examination and will include that person because they should have been included, and can come up with those kinds of rich, detailed estimates of undercount. The post-enumeration survey won't be out for a number of years. It take a couple of years to process all of that information, and it's mainly useful for trying to redesign what you're going to do going forward with the 2030 census. The demographic analysis will be of use it's already been conducted, and once the redistricting data is available towards the end of this year, end of September, it will give us some indication of how we did in terms of count. Here's an example of the use of demographic analysis to look at undercount and overcount by age. This is using data from the 2010 census. This is from a presentation that Bill O'Hare, a demographer, who worked with the Annie Casey Foundation and has been very focused on the undercount of young children. You can see that in this chart, comparing what the 2010 census counted and what the estimate prepared using demographic analysis had for the US population, that they estimate that 4.6% undercount of young children 0 to 4 and a 2.2% undercount of children 5 to 9. Note the overcount of persons aged 15 to 19, 20 to 24, and it's believed that that's primarily college students who are double counted at the college community where they live while going to school, which is, according to census rules, is where their usual place of residence and where they should be counted. But a number of parents will also include them in the family home. And so that's thought to be the source of that overcount. And then the over and under count, at least for the total population, is pretty close for the ages 25 to 29 on up to 45 to 49. And then as we look at the older population, we see that overcount increases. And that could be due to mobile population, people with second homes, and other means of over-reporting residents. Anyway, that's one way of evaluating the quality of the census. Here's how it's calculated. This is for the ages 0 to 4. And if we start with the births that have occurred in the 5 years prior to the census, those are the folks who we would expect to be there on census day, 21,120,000, minus deaths that occurred to those who had been born in the 5 years prior to the census, subtract 154,000, and then those two numbers are very good. They come from the National Center for Health Statistics that the Census Bureau uses in its calculations. The weakest is the estimate of net international migration, ages 0 to 4. And so the Census Bureau estimates that there were 240,000 of those that you would add to the births minus deaths to come up with an estimate of 21,206,000 people age 0 to 4. The 2010 census counted 20,201,000. Therefore, that's where they derive a net undercount of 1,005,000 people. Then my final topic is this balancing of privacy and utility in the census. Now, it's been an issue every census, both individuals and how to protect the confidentiality of census responses, and people objecting to the census as an intrusion of their privacy. So courts have upheld the census headcount and the additional statistics authorized by Congress to be constitutional. The 1870 Supreme Court characterized as unquestionable the power of Congress to require both an enumeration and the collection of statistics in the census. In 2000, there was a lawsuit, and the federal courts ruled that the 2000 census and the census questions did not violate the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy and unreasonable search. It's clear that the degree to which these questions intrude upon an individual's privacy is limited, given the methods used to collect the census data and the statutory assurance that the answers and attribution to an individual will remain confidential. The degree to which the information is needed for the promotion of legitimate governmental interests has been found to be significant. I've highlighted or bolded that part that says statutory assurance that the answers and attribution to an individual will remain confidential. This is what the Census Bureau is wrestling with now, and we're going to talk about modern techniques of changes in the world of data have threatened the ability to even summary data from the Census Bureau, that there are techniques that can re-identify individuals' characteristics in the census. And so this is spelled out that it's constitutional because they can protect against attribution of individual characteristics. So this Census Bureau's new privacy protections, it's a process called differential privacy, and it's a mathematical means of altering responses to prevent re-identification of individuals in census data products. Modern computers in today's data-rich world have rendered the Census Bureau's traditional confidentiality protection methods obsolete. There was very little noise that was introduced, a little bit of swapping and fuzzing of answers, and that was sufficient to protect individuals up to the present environment. This effort at differential privacy is led by John Abau, who is now the Census Bureau's chief scientist. Many of you know John. He's on leave from Cornell University, and in fact was my former boss when he was director of the Cornell Institute for Social and Economic Research. So John is at the center of this controversy. Ron Jarman, acting director of the Census Bureau, states that they need to find the sweet spot balancing confidentiality and data utility. And that's where this argument really lies, is if you overprotect the data, you destroy any use you could make of the data. It's too noisy, it's not accurate. It can't be used in not only academic analysis, but it can't be used for governmental purposes. If you don't protect it, then it is possible to re-identify some of the individual responses within the census. So the question, is it possible to re-identify individuals in the census small area data products? The Census Bureau releases tabulations of responses, not only at the county and the municipal level, but at census tracts, at block groups, and down to blocks. For redistricting purposes, the census data is published at the block level, and that's what is used by government to redistrict all kinds of elected office areas. So in order to test this, the Census Bureau themselves took on the role of a hacker and trying to re-identify people in the census. They started with a powerful commercial database, not their own, but one that's commercially available, that has names, addresses, sex, and ages of the US population. Any of you have ever tried to Google your own name, have probably been amazed and said, my goodness, yes, they know who I am, and they know quite a bit about me. So these commercial databases are out there and are of relatively recent origin. Using public data for census blocks from the 2010 census, the Census Bureau was able to make a probabilistic link with the commercial database. So the commercial database already knew your name, your address, your sex, and your age. But now the Census Bureau said we can link to that using the public data for census blocks and add the attributes of race and ethnicity to those individuals, and therefore re-identify them. This was able to correctly re-identify 17% of the respondents to the 2010 census. Although the hacker would not know which of those records they have correctly re-identified, but this was enough of a re-identification for the Census Bureau to say, we have to do something. Now, you can't have full privacy and full accuracy for all uses. It's impossible. So the question is, where do we find that sweet spot on this, the balance? What degree of privacy can be sacrificed? We can't have full privacy, but how much privacy can we sacrifice in order to preserve that there is some accuracy of the data for uses? On the other hand, what degree of accuracy for those uses can we sacrifice? We can't have full accuracy for all uses. what are we willing to sacrifice in order to maintain a degree of privacy on which characteristics? Here's a graph that the Census Bureau presented at a National Academy of Sciences workshop on the privacy issues. This was in late 2018 to try to explain their approach to the differential privacy. At the top of the graph is an orange line at the 17% level. And that's referring to the results of their experiment that they were able to re-identify 17% of the population, adding the race and ethnic characteristics to that commercial database correctly. Using differential privacy, it's called a privacy loss budget, and the variable is an epsilon, a statistical measure of how much of the privacy you're able to protect. In this case, it's privacy loss. So a loss of 0 means total confidentiality. Total confidentiality translates into totally useless information. So you can't, you know, the more you protect the data, the more you sacrifice utility. The more you increase utility, we call it accuracy, the more you sacrifice privacy, if that's clear. That a privacy loss budget at the right-hand side of the column, an epsilon of 16, that you could re-identify 8% of the records from the 2010 census. So down from 17 to 8%. The Census Bureau is currently, they put out a demonstration project in which they set the epsilon below 2, in which only 2% of the records could be re-identified. And that's the one that I'm going to show you some what that means in terms of neighborhood level data within Tompkins County. So this is not just an academic exercise. There is currently going forward a lawsuit that was initiated by Alabama, and 16 other states have joined in, suing to stop the Census Bureau from applying differential privacy to the redistricting data files. This is the latest information that I had about the lawsuit comes from April 13th. So we're talking just 9 days ago. We're in the middle of this battle right now. We don't know how it's going to turn out. The Census Bureau has said that they're making improvements that will allow to basically find the appropriate sweet spot. They recognize that those early efforts made the data not useful. And the question is, if it's not useful for redistricting, then why in the world do we do a census? That it violates the constitutional obligation that districts have equal populations, because the population number, it would also have harm long-running research on health and safety. This is all part of the Alabama brief. And then they go on to say, and the distorting impact of differential privacy will likely fall hardest on some of the most vulnerable populations, rural areas and minority racial groups. All right, so briefly, let me show you what this means for the census tracts of Tompkins County. This is a map of the city of Ithaca to show you, what geographic scale we're talking about with census tracts. Tracts tend to have approximately 4,000 people. They can have as few as 3 or 2,500 people, or they can have as many as 6 or 8,000. But think about a census tract as an area of roughly 4,000 people. And the local governments have a role in deciding what boundaries they want to use for census tracts to make it useful for planning and public safety and public health and other applications. So census tract data are very important data. Now, here's a census tract that is centered on the Cornell campus, tract number 3. Sorry, I left the R out of tract. That was a tactless mistake. Sorry about that. This is for males by age around the Cornell campus. The orange is the actual 2010 census from the summary files for that census tract. The blue is the result of using differential privacy to protect the information in that. And this looks pretty good, that the distortion, the noise, is not very much. It wouldn't probably lead to different conclusions for various applications. This is the best tract in Tompkins County. Moving on to tract number 2 and females in the College Town neighborhood. You can see that the blue for females age 21, instead of the about 930 females, is saying there were 750. So it substantially underreports the number of females in that census tract. It overreports the number aged 30 to 34. And then there's this curious bump at age 50 to 54, where it's saying there are 100 females aged 50 to 54, when there are, according to the 2010 census, something like 20. Okay. Tract number 1, the area around the commons, and this is looking at males. Some of the biggest discrepancies, you can see that the deviation between the actual data from the 2010 census and this demonstration product is getting worse. That persons aged 10 to 14 are in far larger numbers than they were in the actual census. That persons aged 25 to 29 far more again, and other age groups. Particularly look at 80 to 84 and 85 and above. So programs aimed at senior citizens, the Tompkins County Office for Aging would probably be shocked to be given these data and told that, you know, you've got almost 180 to 84-year-olds and 85-year-olds, and no matter how hard you searched in the neighborhoods, you wouldn't find them because they weren't there. Here's the Cayuga Heights census tract. One of the more substantial differences, persons aged 30 to 34, persons aged 45 to 49, way over in the demonstration product, way under for 45 to 49. Here's the village of Lansing. Again, extreme deviations. Enfield. If you're planning school enrollment and you're looking at the number of 0 to 4-year-olds, look at what the demonstration product is telling you. There's over 250 0 to 4-year-olds in that census tract, and when in reality there were about 130 and other age categories where there's a wide discrepancy. And then the last one I'm going to show you is here, the town of Lansing females, and 30 to 34-year-old, a big spike, and then 35 to 39, tremendous underreporting. The problem with this is these aren't survey data. This is supposed to represent an actual enumeration of the total population. So there's no sampling error. These data are the gold standard, the decennial census, that back up all kinds of other survey work and analysis for a variety of governmental purposes. Given all of the problems that the census had in data collection and data processing, what is the price we're going to pay for data privacy? And what will be the ultimate quality of the 2020 census when it's released? Well, the question about whether it's a success or a shortcoming, I think boils down to the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And since my career has focused on the use of census data, I am very concerned about problems that may reduce the usefulness of the census. I would much rather have the pudding be yummy and enjoy the 2020 census to the extent that this young person seems to be enjoying their pudding. Thank you. I think we can take some questions now.
So Warren, you hear me?
Yes.
Dan has also been active in answering some questions on the chat. So Dan, if you're still around, if you want to join into the responses that Warren is making, that'd be great. So if you look on the Q&A, Warren, there are some questions that have built out there.
Okay.
One of the questions was, how did self-response in Collegetown compare in 2010?
Okay. So 27% in 2020, 52% in 2010. 52% is not great. 27% is potentially disastrous.
And another question comes in. It says, would you say that prior to utilization of input via internet responses by inhabitants, that privacy and utility more closely approximated 100% desirable outcome with these concerns?
I don't see how internet response affects privacy. Whether you answer those questions online or you answer those questions in paper format. I think one thing that might be a factor, and I had tried to raise this, was that we know that a lot of respondents, so the Census Bureau is talking about mathematical means to inject noise into people's responses. We know that some individuals who are wary of surveys say, all right, I'll respond to this survey, but I'm not going to give them actual answers. I'm going to fudge my answers a little bit. And whether responding by paper or responding online, that there's a difference of people fudging their answers. I frankly don't know. I haven't seen anything about that.
Another question comes in and says, does Google Maps contribute info to the census?
Contribute what?
Contribute information to the census.
Oh, yes. Google Maps was a important resource, one of the mapping sources of mapping that the Census Bureau used in their in-office address canvassing.
Some of the other questions Dan answered, I can kind of put them up. One of the questions was, why is Hispanic origin, why was it listed separate from race? Dan answered, Hispanic origin is the ethnicity, culture, including language, not a race. About half of all Hispanics define themselves as white. Do you want to comment on that?
That's an ongoing issue, and the Census Bureau experimented with a question that would not have them as two separate questions, but one single question, and lack of lack of funding and resources sort of pulled the plug on that. So I think the Census Bureau was definitely headed in the direction of not making it separate, but making Hispanic co-equal with white and black and other categories. So it's not clear cut. Not everybody likes the terminologies. Not everybody can, the self-perception of what you are. The Census Bureau tries to find the one that works the best.
There was another question that came in and said then why there was not an item for Arab origin. Dan responded, there is an Arab question at one point prior to the 2020 census, but was then eliminated against the Bureau's recommendation. Right now, Arabs or Middle Easterners usually define themselves as non-Hispanic white per instructions, and that comes from Dan Leiter. Do you want to comment on that?
No, Dan has it absolutely right. Again, that was similar to the unification into one question. That's the race category that didn't make the cut. It's just, it's like anyway, it almost made it onto the 2020 census.
And another question comes, given that the 1790, it was stated that all inhabitants shall be counted in the census, why did African Americans living in the United States not appear by name in the census until 1870? Dan responded, they were only counted as 2/3 of a person for reapportionment purposes, but that was the grand compromise between slave states and the northern states. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, the treatment of enslaved persons was abhorrent throughout American society. The census treated them as if they were chattel, no different than how many cattle did you have? It's reprehensible. The compromise, the figure I have is 3/5 of the, count as 3/5 of a person. And that was the non-slave states trying to limit the political power of the slaveholding states. The slaveholding states wanted them counted as a whole person. That it was not empowering or disempowering of the enslaved persons themselves, but rather the wrangling between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states.
John Abel asks, please comment on current policy for counting of prisoners, usual home versus prison site.
Okay, the census counts people at their usual place of residence. Prisoners' usual place of residence is within the prison. The census states are, for purposes of redistricting, are able to adjust those numbers, and as long as they do it fairly and not in violation of voting rights. And so the Census Bureau supplies additional information about the group quarters population, the prison population, to states. New York is one of the states that tries to make adjustment to those numbers for the purposes of redistricting. Interestingly, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, when this issue was raised back when he was a senator, reminded people in New York State that if you treat prisoners from where they come from rather than where they live, then perhaps you should treat college students the same way. And that for New York State, and particularly New York City, which is a real magnet for college students, and there are far more college students than there are prisoners, that the net result would be negative for those areas. Still, it's hardly seems fair that a area with a lot of prisoners, such as some of the rural areas of upstate New York, have representation in the state Senate and the state Assembly that is far greater per voting person than it is in the urban areas, as well as the funding that is tied to population numbers. So again, it's an ongoing issue, and there are attempts to regulate it. Personally, I think it should be regulated legislatively, count people where they are, but make adjustments as far as representation and allocation of funding.
So Warren, can you hear me?
Yes.
I have an associated question. So something that you taught me a few years back was that the population in dormitories, college dormitories, the census forms are filled out by the supervisors in the dormitories and not by the students themselves. I think that's correct.
The college has the choice as to how it wants to do it.
So my question is, if that's the case, did the people who filled out the forms at Cornell for the 2020 census count the number of people who had dormitory contracts, or the number of people who were actually physically present in the dorms during the semester, since so many people went to their parents' home?
Right. So yes, that's my understanding, is that the dormitory, the on-campus population, got correctly enumerated and correctly in terms of the way that the Census Bureau wanted them. You know, the students who lived off campus who left and knew that they weren't going to be back for quite some time, or at least they didn't know when they'd be back, they may have said, hey, my usual place of residence is now my parents' home. The Census Bureau tried to communicate in a very difficult communication to say, no, we want you to report your residence where you would have been had it not been for the pandemic. So that's a tough road to hoe.
Okay, so I think that it's getting late, and I'm going to use my prerogative to thank Warren, and I'm also going to thank Dan Lichter, who's no longer with us, but who answered a lot of questions. Warren, I'm sorry to tell you this, but if this was a in-person talk, you would have gotten a small gift. We have an IOU. You have an IOU from us. We'll try to acknowledge that a little bit later. This has been a really informative talk. I've been thinking about this for my entire career, and I learned lots of new things today. And so if there was an opportunity to give you an applause, you would get a good applause now. Thanks again. And everybody, see you next month for our next talk. So goodbye.
Thank you. You're welcome. My pleasure.
Okay.